So the prisoner's dilemma is this situation that has this set reward structure to it and these set strategies that the two individuals can adopt. Now, it's been given a number of different vignettes, a number of different stories that provide characters and real outcomes for people to understand that situation that's described really abstractly using mathematics. And Merle Flood, together with his colleague at the Rand Corporation, Melvin Drescher, were really the first people to explicitly characterize those choices using mathematics, and they did this in 1950. And later that year, Princeton's Albert Tucker gave the prisoner's dilemma description to that mathematics. And so that's where we get the name prisoner's dilemma, the vignette that describes the situation that Flood and Drescher characterized for the first time using mathematics in 1950. This is John Nash. Now, if you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind is about John Nash. John Nash won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he did so because he formulated this notion of a Nash equilibrium, that is, a state in which each player has adopted a strategy that is an optimal response to the strategies adopted by other players. In other words, nobody has an incentive to deviate from their chosen strategy because their strategy gives them the best possible outcome given the strategies of everyone else. And so it's a sort of stable state, as it were. And in 1951, Nash wrote his famous article, Non-Cooperative Games. And in this article, what he does is he defines a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. That is, a mixed strategy is simply a game in which people adopt different strategies. There are multiple strategies and people adopt different strategies. And the Nash equilibrium for these games is the set of strategies that are adopted by the individuals such that it achieves a Nash equilibrium. They have no incentive to change their strategies because their given strategy is the best one given the strategies of the other players. He then goes on to demonstrate that for any game with a finite set of actions, at least one mixed strategy, at least one combination of these strategies by the individual participants will achieve a Nash equilibrium. So a Nash equilibrium always exists. And it's this work that ultimately won Nash the Nobel Prize. For 30 years, however, game theory was dominated by thinking about the prisoner's dilemma as a two-person game with a single iteration. And there is a Nash equilibrium for that game. Right? And in that Nash equilibrium, both of the players defect. That is, both of the players testify against each other. Now you might think to yourself, well, how can that possibly be the optimal strategy for each of these players to adopt? Well, from your own perspective, right, what you're trying to do is get your best outcome, given that you don't know what the other person's strategy is going to be. And so when you're thinking about what you should do, right, if you defect, that is, if you testify against the other person, then what's the worst outcome for you? Well, the worst outcome for you is if they defect against you and you get 3 years. Right? So mutual defection results in 3 years. That's still better than the worst individual outcome, which is 5 years. And so you get a better outcome than you would if you were to try to cooperate when the other person defected. So defection makes sense in the worst case scenario for you for defection. What about the best case scenario for defection? Suppose you defect, that is, you decide to testify against the other person, and the other person decides to try and cooperate. Well, then you get your best individual outcome. They get their worst individual outcome, but you get your best. And so from your perspective, trying to maximize your outcome, that is, minimize your time in jail, the best strategy for you is to defect. Now, you know that about your choices, and you also know that that's true for the other person as well. So if you think the other person is the rational agent, then you can anticipate they're likely to defect as well. And if they defect, your best strategy is definitely to defect as well. And so that's why the Nash equilibrium, the best set of strategies, is for both people to defect. Now, that's the prisoner's dilemma, played once by naive partners. They don't know anything about each other or what they'll do. Okay? However, one experiment turned this whole idea, Ridley tells us, on its head. And that single experiment was when people started thinking about, hey, what would be the best strategy? What would be a Nash equilibrium if the prisoner's dilemma was not played just one time by naive partners, but was played over and over and over again by the same people, so that each iteration, each time you play the game, you now know something about the choices that the other person is likely to make. And it turned out that was, as it were, a game changer. Right? That single thought experiment, that single idea, showed that, according to Ridley anyway, theorists had drawn the entirely wrong lesson from the prisoner's dilemma. That selfishness isn't the rational thing to do after all. At least, it's not the rational thing to do if you are going to engage in other interactions with that individual at any time in the future. So, single case, naive players, the rational thing to do is always defect. However, if you're going to see these people again, if you're going to get into those situations again, it turns out that's not the rational choice. And so Ridley points us towards this fellow here. In the 70s, this guy, John Maynard Smith, he rediscovers this result. Right? This result was a result that had been figured out by a couple of people in the past, but it kind of been lost in modern game theory. And what Maynard realized is that when the game is played repeatedly and indefinitely by a single pair of individuals, then what's happened in previous iterations turns out to matter. And the strategy that, it turns out, achieves a Nash equilibrium isn't to always defect. It turns out to be a nicer strategy. And so, as Ridley puts it, niceness and not nastiness prevails. And Maynard Smith, he was an engineer, but he was also a geneticist. And so he hypothesized that biology could use game theory as profitably as economics could. And he argued that just as rational individuals should adopt strategies like those predicted by game theory, natural selection should design animals to behave instinctively and employ similar strategies. And so he encouraged biologists to go out and try and find examples of the Nash equilibrium strategy that he had discovered for multiple iterations of the prisoner's dilemma.